if we have to do some repairs, designs have to be made, correct?
That's right. And I think I'm going to pass this off to Tim, but I think the first thing we need to make clear is that oftentimes in residential construction, there has to be some form of submittal of a drawing to the building department, whether it's county or city, doesn't matter. And then I'm going to pass it off to Tim. He can talk about the different types of designs and consulting people you're going to bring in.
So let's set the stage, though. We've had a home inspection. The corrections need to be made in order, let's say, to complete the sale or before the house goes on the market. And somebody has to do the drawings so that we could submit it to the city for building department.
Right. So it depends on what's being done. If it's structural repair, a company like MG Constructors and Engineers can do the design and the drawings for the repair and run those permits and take care of everything. A lot of times, though, with a remodel especially, sometimes, let's say we have to repair a wall or something, and the buyer says, well, I've always wanted to tear that wall out. I want to make this room bigger, or for whatever reason that they have. So it's more than just a structural repair at that point. Now it's a remodel. And at that point, a plan needs to be done. If you want the end product to be good, the end product is going to be directly proportional to the quality of your plan. And that's when I always recommend bringing in a qualified designer or architect to do the plan. They know the right questions to ask of the homeowner. They know what to ask about finishes and floors, and they pretty well understand the whole picture, and we'll get it on paper so that it can get a permit, so that it can be built right.
Okay, oftentimes we hear, for instance, in home inspection said, we need a qualified specialist or a structural engineer. So let's touch on that a bit.
Okay, on which
you
one?
are in terms of they
engineering
wanted an
piece?
engineer,
Okay.
quote unquote,
Right.
or a specialist.
So usually when somebody asks for a structural engineer, they're asking for a registered, licensed engineer qualified to do structural analysis and design. In California law, there's a distinction between a structural engineer and a licensed engineer who's able to do and qualified to do structural analysis. And a structural engineer generally doesn't do much work, not always, but they generally don't do much work in the residential sector. It's usually more an engineer like me, a licensed professional engineer. My degree is in civil engineering. Structures is what I specialize in. I'm the guy usually that they're after, or someone with a similar license as me.
Okay, now I know between the two of you, you've inspected thousands of buildings.
Yeah.
So you might be one of the first professionals out there and identify the problem, say you will need this type of work done. In terms of how many players does the owner of the building have to work with? We have the contractor originally, then we're going to some sort of engineer.
Well,
right?
typically, let's talk about that because that's a good question. We're also going to talk about commercial versus residential. We're strictly speaking about residential right now.
Right.
So most of the time, there's some either repair needed to be done, or there's some remodel or addition or whatever. We're talking specifically right now about repairs. Oftentimes we'll find foundation repairs, we'll find retaining wall repairs, we'll find roof related sags, anything like that. That's when we would start out with a base drawing. That could be done, already be done. We could already have that as part of the package from the seller, or if somebody had that already. And then we would take that drawing, modify it for the work that needed to be done. A guy like Tim would then do his engineering on that. We would then go to the jurisdiction, submit that, get a permit, and then we could start the work and go ahead and do that.
Okay, that sounds all pretty easy, but that could take a week or 2 or 3.
It can take as short as 3 to 5 days sometimes, and sometimes it can take 3 to 6 months.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Now you mentioned in terms of the drawings. If it's simple drawings, are we talking a couple $100? If it gets involved, we talking
thousands? That's a
thousands?
good question. I'm going to answer some of that, and then I'm going to let
Okay.
Tim talk about what we call value engineering and other aspects of that. But typically, you're going to be required to get either a licensed architect or a licensed engineer in the end run to do the final set of plans, and oftentimes structural calculations. Most of the charges in that range start somewhere between 500 and 750 and go upwards up to a lot, depending on the complexity of the project. So, a base rate for a good licensed engineer architect somewhere between $125 and $175 an hour is their billable rate, and it depends on how complex and how much the project is. Now, getting into the types of design we do, I'm going to pass off to Tim, and he can talk about that.
Okay.
Okay, so if we're talking structural repairs, let's just do an example. We're working on a project now in Monte Sereno, and the project started as an underpinning project. So part of the house had settled, and underpinning is where you put piers in the ground, and then you lift the settled portion back up. And so that's a repair, and I did the plans for that, and the cost was, I don't remember, but $1,500 to do the design and the plan for that, give or take. Mm-hmm. Now, this homeowner also wants to do some remodeling. And at that point, it's not a structural repair that he wants to do. So he's got several different projects going on under one roof. At that point, I suggested to him, get an architect involved to help you with that remodel portion.
Flush out those ideas.
Right. And the cost for an architect to do, well, it totally depends on what needs to be done. It could be $1,000, it could be $5,000. A way to look at it is you can say architecture sometimes costs up 10% of the construction cost. It can be all the way down to 5. Somewhere in that 5 to 10% range is a ballpark idea for architectural costs.
Okay. Now, I've also heard the term designer.
Right.
They say, well, I'm not an architect, but I am a designer, and I do basically the same thing.
Right. And in the residential world, a lot of times, instead of an architect, which is a state license to become an architect, the state, actually in this state, I'm not sure if designers are licensed or not.
They're not.
They're not. Okay. So it's in the state of California, it's an unlicensed profession, but they do the same types of things as architects. Mm-hmm. They draw plans up, they can help you get your permitting, and I work with many very competent, capable designers who, for any number of projects, I would select just as soon as any architect that I know also. And usually their fees run a little bit less than a licensed architect, just in general.
Okay.
Yeah, and that's strictly in residential. Once you graduate into either public works or commercial buildings, then you have to use licensed architects and licensed engineers.
Okay.
No.
Now, is that the same for a fourplex, a triplex, duplex?
Yeah, typically in living residences, something like that. Now, when you get into multi-story, that's a different deal. And it also depends on the building jurisdiction. The building jurisdiction has the right most of the time to say, no, we want a licensed structural engineer, for example, on a building to do that. They do it, and some do that.
Okay.
Yeah.
We had met, Mark, I don't know, 10 years ago, so I had asked about drainage and foundations, and your name kept coming up. You're one of the players in that arena. When we oftentimes we say, well, we have to do a survey or a geological review, and now we're getting into different areas that most people work with who live in the suburbs with a sidewalk and street lamp don't get involved with.
On drainage type work, and most of the time in the suburbs and in the residential application, you do not need civil engineering unless you're doing new construction. And then there's pretty comprehensive laws and requirements to do that. But most of the time when the house is there and the drainage plans have already been done, it's built, it's a matter of getting a qualified person in there who knows how to evaluate the drainage issues and then coming up with a repair. And interestingly enough, a lot of drainage work does not require a building permit. But,
really?
Oh yeah. That being said though, a lot of it does. If it involves retaining walls, if it involves a grading plan, then definitely it involves not only that, it requires engineered drawings, etc. So I want to be careful in saying that, but that's one of the few things on a typical like residential lot that if the house is existing and the drainage was put in when it was built and you're going in to improve it and make it better, sometimes it does not require a permit.
Okay, I know in my conversations with specialists like yourself in terms of the settling of a house where the back bedrooms might be going south, right? They talked about back when the homes were built in the 50s and 60s, they didn't prepare the pad or the pillow that the house sits on.
Right.
Can you describe what that's all about? Just for
Right, especially you run into this issue when you're talking about building sites that are not level. And so if you've got a building site that has a slope to it, usually what a builder likes to do is they like to come in with their dozer and they like to cut from the high side and they push the dirt over to the low side, and the dirt so goes down the slope and it trickles down the slope, and many times they don't compact that dirt that they pushed over the edge. That dirt that they push over the edge is called fill. So you have the cut side where they cut into the bank, they push the dirt over, that becomes the fill side, and if they build the house part on the fill, part on the cut, you can guarantee that the fill side is going to settle and it is going to go down. And so whatever part of the house, the kitchen, the bedroom, the living room, we've seen it all, that part does this part stays here, and that's when you walk through the house and you're going downhill.
Okay. Which is a common problem for a lot of these older houses, especially.
Yeah. And one other comment too, he said hillside a lot of times. We'll see it in certain areas, geologic areas like Willow Glen and San Jose and others where we have that too.
Now, with the, let's talk about remodeling. They are remodeling the home, or for instance, the bad flip, right? What, in terms of, what's stage 1, stage 2 in terms of cost? Who are you writing checks to? The homeowner is writing checks.
Well, let's talk about remodels here specifically. A flip is a remodel oftentimes. Well, number one, know the requirements of your local building jurisdiction, and they do vary from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So, and in the Greater Bay Area, I think we have actively 22 business licenses with all the the jurisdictions we deal with. So there's a bunch. So know your local rules first, and then from there you're going to figure out what you're going to do. That may require one of the things that most homeowners don't know, or residential building owners, that a layperson can do the drawings. They can't do the engineering portion of it. Then somebody like Tim's going to have to take that. But they can, on a simple AutoCAD type program or something like that, do the drawings the way they want, and then hand it off to a competent design professional and engineer to do the drawings. Then they're going to go into the building department, and then we get into the cost. And the cost for building departments varies widely. Some jurisdictions are really not that expensive. Other ones are extremely expensive. And so a simple remodel, for example, in an outer line area with a smaller town might be a third or a quarter of the cost. It might cost, say, $800 to $1,200, whereas in a metropolitan area, that same remodel the permits might be $5,000.
Wow.
Yeah.
What about new construction, for instance, here in California?
Right.
Where does the homeowner building their dream home, where do they start to do this?
Okay, the best way to start, I would suggest, is start with an architect or a designer and get somebody local, get somebody who you can get some referrals from. There are certain architects who I have worked with that I won't work with anymore. They just, I didn't get along with them. I didn't felt like they were a real team player type person. And so it depends on personalities. And an architect is really a key person for anybody building a new home, because there are so many decisions and choices that you have to make as you go through that process. Not only the layout of the house and the rooms, but the roof pitch, the roof materials, the carpets, the appliances, what type of heating system. The architect, again, is the hub of that entire decision process. And the engineers are brought in, but they're sort of ancillary. It's not to say that the engineers aren't necessary, because they are, but really the architect is the hub.
Now, in terms of, Mark, when they have that patch of land that they bought, let's say it's 5 acres, and whether it's their dream home, far away in California or in the rural areas here in the Bay Area, they still have to hire somebody to bulldoze the street, or their pathway up to their plot and all that, right?
Well, I think this all by itself is a pretty deep topic of conversation. So when you build a new home and you're taking a piece of undeveloped property and you're developing it, there's a very comprehensive process called a site plan review that's required by most. In this case, you're probably in the county. You're not going to be in a city jurisdiction.
Right.
And they're going to require you to do a boundary survey of the property line. They're going to require you to have an access road that has a certain amount of width and that fire truck access, for example, easements away from property line and or streets. And there's sometimes some like PG&E easements or city easements and things like that you have to respect. And that process by itself is very expensive. A lot of fees are involved with that, and there's a lot of consulting involved. You're going to have surveyors, engineers. A lot of times you're bringing in a geotech, and in certain areas you're going to have an engineering geologist. And so all these consultants are going to put together a very comprehensive plan set. Now that is going to be submitted to the building jurisdiction, where it's going to be reviewed by the planning department, the building department, the Department of Public Works, the fire marshal. And sometimes you have like a sanitary district. And so all the requirements have to be met on that design drawing. And it's like I say, that sometimes is a 1 to 2 year project just to get it ready to build.
That's before a carpenter is throwing a hammer that's
Exactly
tens of thousands of dollars. And if it's in a rural area, you might have to check for the butterflies and the owls and everything else.
Yeah,
right?
that's a good point.
Now, Tim, I see as a real estate broker, as I go through neighborhoods oftentimes, a home will all of a sudden be rebuilt. And it's the same homeowner that's been there for decades. They rebuilt their own home to make it their dream home. What would something like that be from scratch? How would they?
So in other words, they have the house they've lived in all these years, and now they want to do a very comprehensive remodel. Is that what you're describing?
Yeah, basically, rather than having their dream home in Tahoe, they're just going to do it right where they've been for the last 20 years and build it right there.
So are you saying they're going to demo?
Well, sometimes I'm just driving by, and all of a sudden, it used to be one type of house, and now it's a brand new house. Doesn't look anything like the other one. So sometimes they keep a wall.
I think I could answer a real good question there. We did one in Los Gatos where the same thing. The couple was deciding whether they were going to move or whatever, and they decided, let's just fix ours. So we literally lifted up. Tim designed the basement under it. We lifted a 2-story home with an attached garage up in the air. We put a basement under it, 2,400 square feet, set it back down on there, finished the basement out, then went through and completely remodeled the interior and the first and second story.
Wow.
It was probably about an $800,000 project by the time they were done.
Wow.
And again, that took quite a while. The basement alone was a 6-month project. And that had to be done first, set back down. Once we got it down and bolted and all that stuff, then they went to work on the finishes, and they being all the subcontractors and whatnot.
But as far as permitting goes, it's pretty much the same thing, except you don't have the boundary line issues probably. But still, I would start with an architect, because they're familiar with all of these issues, all the ones that Mark just mentioned, from the setbacks and the easements. They know the trigger items. They know whether or not they are the expert. They know who to call to get in. Again, the hub of the wheel.
It seems to me what triggered that question is when you mentioned in a rural area, they have to have all this access for the fire department and curbs and street lamps and whatnot. But when they're doing it in the suburbs, all of that's already in.
Yeah.
Now we just have to focus on the property.
Right. And especially if it's already there. And if you're going to stay within the footprint of the building, it's even simpler. So, for example, it's relatively simple to remodel an existing home versus to add on to it, go up or out. And one other thing, too, as far as cost, you should consult with a good engineer and or builder, or both, to do what we call value engineering. So, for example, a lot of time a person will come to us in the decision process of buying a home and say, well, we want to add square footage. What's better, going up or going out? And it depends on the lot, it depends on the location, depends on the existing condition of the existing framing and the foundation. A lot of times the foundation and frame is so old and out of code that we'll say, well, look, it's probably better to marry up to it with a new addition and treat that as a new code upgrade and leave the rest of it as is. Much more cost effective. And that's one of those decisions that you get your...
I know. The first time I seen it, I was downtown Sacramento, and there was a house up on blocks. And I was talking to the neighbor, said they're putting in a full basement. They're going to add another layer downstairs below ground.
Yep, we do
So it's becoming more and more popular.
Yeah.
I think it is. is.
There's a lot of favor to that too, because it oftentimes does not affect the floor area ratio. So if you have a smaller lot, you can oftentimes add basement square footage, whereas they won't let you build up and out. They being the building department and planning department.
Now, in terms of the, let's talk about rehab. We talked about remodeling, but if something has fire damage or water damage or things like that, do they still need to get engineering, or at what point can we just have a contractor come in here and make it whole
That's
again?
a good question, and I'll tell you what, we're dealing with one right now like this, where there was an electrical fire in an unpermitted addition to an existing structure.
Perfect.
And they called their insurance agent. Their insurance agent sent out the company, a general contractor, to do it.
Uh-oh.
The general contractor didn't follow the law, didn't pull permits, got the homeowner in a bunch of trouble with the code enforcement officials of that area.
Wow.
They shut it down, red tagged it, and then he said, "What do I do?" They referred our company in there, and now we got him back on track. But it's probably a 4 or 5 month project to finish now.
Holy smokes.
Yeah, and it doesn't matter if it's a permitted, everything was right. You still have to go through the permitting process. They treat it just like it's a remodel or whatever.
It's a good point in terms of when people have these additions without permits, there's no value there, because if the house burns to the ground, insurance company doesn't have to rebuild that section.
That I don't know about how the
Yeah.
insurance companies handle. I do know that insurance companies pretty much write their policies pretty tightly, and so it's a good idea that when you're getting your insurance on your home that you know exactly what you're signing up for, because a lot of times we'll be brought in and the policy won't cover a lot of the damage that happened. And we've had cars run through buildings. We have, I mean, you name it, they happen. And one time, the car ran literally through the back of a house, and the insurance policy would pay only for the damage to go back the way it was, and if it had to be brought up to code, that wasn't part of the repair. I don't know how you can write a policy like that, but that was what the adjuster told the homeowner and what had to happen.
Now, Tim, in terms of the when they raise a house up in the air, what's some of the issues there in terms of soil?
That's a pretty tricky operation, because the house weighs a lot, and when you raise it, you have workers under that house doing the work, doing the lifting. I mean, you can't grab it from the outside and lift up. You have to lift from the outside and underneath. And it's complicated. And there are specialty contractors, and that's what they do.
That's all they do.
And that's pretty much all they do. And that you should consider getting a specialty contractor if you're gonna do a house lift. And we do that a lot, and that's why I know I don't mess. I'm careful no matter what, but boy, when it comes to lifting a house, I really sharpen my pencil, and I am extremely concerned about that design.
Okay, speaking of costs, we have these new disclosures that have arrived locally here within the last year, and the sellers now have to complete this if that's in their contract here. And I just want to review some of these items here with you, Mark. If we have cracks, settlement, movement, slippage, instability in the foundations, the basement, the crawl space, retaining walls, boundary walls, etc., how does one in your industry build that out? How do you give an estimate to make those repairs?
That's a great question. And I'll tell you what, I see a lot of times where people don't have a good concept of cost, giving cost, and it's erroneous. And especially in a real estate transaction, when you go into it, you need to know, you need to get your arms around the problem, number one, and then get somebody to give you a good assessment of real cost. And the real cost talks about exactly what we're talking about: the design, the permits, the required jurisdictional things that have to happen in order for that to repair, and then for it to be competently done and inspected and closed out properly so that it's finished, the permit's closed, it's a done deal, it's warranted. Those are all important parts of that. And so how do you do that? Well, number one, you get competent people that know what they're doing to help you. And if you don't, you can get sideways.
Okay, when I first met you, and I hear this a lot from people in your profession, we have that seasonal expansion. Can you speak to that? in
Well,
terms of
and soil
solar?
expansion?
Right.
Yeah, particularly in the greater Bay Area, there's what we call fat clay, Santa Clara Formation clay, and it does not drain like sand or gravel at all.
Right.
It's kind of like an inverted bowl or plate. The water hits it, it fills up with water like a kitchen sponge. It expands and it can literally lift your home. It can lift sidewalks. It can lift anything sitting on top of it. It has tremendous forces. So you'll have that literally, your door will pinch shut in the wintertime, and in the summertime, the soil dries out and loses volume and goes down, and the door will open and close fine.
Right.
And that's everywhere in the Bay Area. And so a lot of times, people come to me and say, what do I do? And I say, well, not much. Just wait it out,
Right.
wait till the rain comes, or wait till it dries out.
I know when I was new in the business back in the 80s, the home inspectors were giving us a good tip saying drain that water away from your building because those downspouts go right next to your building, thousands of gallons.
Yeah.
Right,
So
that they
that's
can't
where your
help.
good drainage plan comes into play. And then if you're going to go further on that, when you get drainage that goes in the wrong place, like underneath your foundation,
sure.
in your crawl space, now you have a potential for a lot of problems. It's never, ever, ever, under any circumstance, good to have water going in or under your house or your building.
That's why they call it a fluid situation.
That's right.
The Garrison brothers